I'm not the kind of person who believes in ghosts or curses. At least I wasn't before this trip. It's been a few months since it happened, but I'm still not sure what we experienced that night. I'll try my best to lay it all out for you. It started with an idea. My two friends, Nate and Sophie, and I had been planning a road trip for weeks. We wanted to hit a few off-the-beaten-path spots. We were all into urban legends and creepy folklore, but more in a, wouldn't it be fun to check this out way, than actually believing any of it. Nate found an article online about a place called Blackthorn Bridge. Supposedly, it was cursed. People who crossed it either went missing or came back different. The stories ranged from vague to outright absurd. It sounded ridiculous, but it also sounded like the perfect kind of stop for our trip. Blackthorn Bridge was in a remote part of the state, miles from any major town. The drive out there was long, and the further we went, the more isolated we felt. The road turned to gravel, and then to dirt, as we wound through dense woods. The GPS lost signal about 20 minutes from the bridge, so we relied on a screenshot of the directions. By the time we arrived, the sun was setting, and the place had this eerie, quiet vibe. The bridge itself was old and wooden, with sagging planks that looked like they might give out under too much weight. There were no railings, just open space on either side that dropped into a shallow, murky creek below. Sophie was the first to speak. "This looks safe," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Nate laughed nervously, but no one moved to step onto the bridge. We decided to park the car a little ways back and walk the rest of the way. As we got closer, I noticed how the air felt. Heavier, like it was pressing against my skin. It was subtle at first, but the closer we got, the stronger it became. Sophie said she felt it too, but Nate waved it off as our imaginations running wild. When we reached the bridge, Nate pulled out his phone to take a picture. And that's when the first weird thing happened. His phone glitched out, the screen froze, then went black. He held the power button, but it wouldn't turn back on. "That's annoying," he muttered, shoving it back in his pocket. "Let's just do this." We took a few steps onto the bridge. The wood creaked beneath our feet, and the sound seemed louder than it should have been, echoing in a way that didn't make sense. The air felt colder here, and I swear I could hear something. A faint whispering sound that seemed to come from all around us. I told myself it was just the wind moving through the trees, but it didn't feel right. Halfway across, Sophie stopped. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nate and I froze. The whispering grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't wind, it was voices. Too many to count, overlapping and murmuring words I couldn't understand. "Let's keep going," Nate said, but his voice shook. We made it to the other side and stood there for a moment, looking back at the car in the distance. That's when Sophie gasped. "Guys, look." We followed her gaze. At the far end of the bridge, where we'd just come from, there was a figure standing in the shadows. It was hard to make out any details, but it looked like a person. Tall, thin, with tattered clothes that fluttered in the breeze. The figure didn't move. It just stood there watching us. "Is this a joke?" Nate hissed, turning to me. "Did you invite someone to scare us?" "No," I said, my voice shaking. "I swear I didn't." The figure took a step forward, then another. Slowly, deliberately, it began crossing the bridge toward us. "Run!" Sophie said, grabbing my arm. We bolted, sprinting back to the car without looking back. The whispers grew louder as we ran, almost deafening by the time we reached the car. Nate fumbled with the keys, and for a terrifying moment, I thought he'd dropped them, but he managed to unlock the doors and we piled in, slamming them shut. The figure was gone. So was the whispering. We drove to the nearest town and found a cheap motel to crash for the night. We tried to laugh it off, calling it a trick of the light or some weirdo messing with us, but deep down, we knew it wasn't that simple. That night, I had the first nightmare. I was back on the bridge, alone this time. The air was thick. The whispers were louder than ever, but I couldn't understand what they were saying. Then I saw the figure again, standing in the middle of the bridge. It raised a hand, pointing at me, and I woke up gasping for air. The next morning, Sophie and Nate both looked like they hadn't slept either. Sophie said she'd had a similar dream, and when Nate described his, it was almost identical. We agreed to leave town and head back home, cutting the trip short. But as we drove away, the GPS led us in circles. We'd end up back on the same road no matter which direction we turned. After hours of driving, we realized we were back near the bridge. Frustrated and scared, we stopped at a diner to ask for directions. The waitress's face went pale when we mentioned Blackthorn Bridge. "You kids need to stay away from that place," she said. glancing around like she was afraid someone might overhear. Bad things happen there. They always have. We pressed her for details, and she reluctantly told us about a group of teenagers who went missing decades ago. They'd been dared to cross the bridge but never made it back. Locals believed the bridge was cursed, trapping anyone who dared to challenge it. That's when Nate suggested we go back to the bridge and figure this out. I thought he was crazy, but Sophie agreed. That night, we returned to the bridge. Armed with flashlights and a sense of dread, we stepped onto the creaking planks once more. The whispers returned almost immediately, louder and more insistent. Then we saw them, figures moving in the darkness, too many to count. One of them stepped forward, and I recognized her from an old photo we'd seen at the diner. She was one of the missing teens. Her mouth moved, but the words were drowned out by the whispers. Sophie held up the diary we'd found in the car, the one that seemed to belong to the girl. The whispers stopped, replaced by silence so intense, it felt suffocating. Then she spoke. "Help us." We didn't know what to do, but we felt compelled to stay. As the night wore on, the girl explained through fragmented whispers that the only way to free the trapped souls was for someone living to take their place. Nate didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, but instead of disappearing into the darkness, the girl handed him something, an old key. The whispers surged briefly, then faded entirely. Nate turned to us, pale but calm, and said, "I'm staying. You two need to go." We argued, but he insisted. Sophie and I reluctantly left, promising to return with help. As we drove away, the GPS worked again, and the roads were clear. But a few miles from the bridge, the car's engine sputtered, forcing us to stop. In the distance, I thought I saw a figure on the horizon watching. It wasn't Nate, and it wasn't alone. What did the key mean? Was it supposed to protect us or trap him? And who or what are the others I saw out there?